I think I covered everything there. Alrighty. Hello and welcome to the stream Parson reads the Book of Acts. And today we are going to probably have a shorter stream because I only really plan on one chapter today. I didn't take a lot of notes for what I was going to read next week, so yeah, that's a thing. So we might just do chapter 16. I could just kind of wing chapter 17 because I know chapter 17 pretty well, so I could do it. I don't need to make more notes than what I already have, I guess you could say. So we'll see. Depends on our timing for how we go through chapter 16. But chapter 16 has quite a lot of content in itself. I mean, basically all these later chapters kind of do. It's just the nature of the Book of Acts. But with that said, you're probably wondering, well, what the heck? You're doing a reading stream on Wednesdays? Well, the reason behind that is because my work schedule is changing. And so I'm working Fridays from like early afternoon, like morning to early afternoon, but I kind of don't want to, work for like 8 hours and then rush the reading streams. And so I think changing for the next little while, we're going to change up how we do the reading streams as well. And so for the next month or so, we're going to do Bible reading streams on Wednesdays. Well, okay, this is how I picture in my head anyway at the moment, because the scheduling could change again on short notice, so anything can happen. But at least the way I play it out in my head, the next month or so we'll finish the Book of Acts, or get through most of it in the next month or so. Because in the Book of August, in the month of August, we are going to do something else on the channel, and so that will take our Monday, Wednesday normal streaming schedule time. And then I'll have to really figure out what I'm going to do about the Bible reading streams, because Tuesday and Thursdays obviously don't work. As a matter of fact, I plan to, at some point, boot up a new Throwback Thursday series where I play an old game, talk about stuff. So Throwback Thursdays might come back. And then Saturdays I don't want to stream, because who's actually gonna be at home watching streams on a Saturday. I mean, people do that, but I doubt you guys would be at home watching a stream on a Saturday. So to stream on Saturday, I feel like it's kind of pointless. So we'll figure out how we go about the reading streams in the future. I'll let you know more details as we go down the line. But for the next while, like for the month of July, we'll probably do our reading streams on Wednesdays. And then I might do some game streams here and there on Saturdays when I have time. But I'm going to be pretty busy, especially in the month of July. So we'll see how that goes down. But basically, yeah, there's just changes happening for the next little while. So the streaming schedule is all messed up. But hey, if you want to know when I am streaming, hey, hit that subscribe, hit those bell notifications and stuff like that. Make sure your settings are on always notice, so that you guys know when I'm back online. Because, I mean, at this point, it's whenever I have time to do it. And with that said, we're going to read chapter 16 today. In the Book of Acts, I'll be reading from the New International Version. I encourage you guys to follow along with me if you guys just use your desktop. The Bible is free online, so why not use it? Bible app, whatever. Float your boat. I just have a paper copy, but I always encourage use online Bibles, because you can always have it on hand. And so, with that said, we're going to start off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll begin the stream, or the reading anyway. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we continue reading your word, you would continue to inspire us how to be faithful to you. And as the world around us constantly changes, I just pray that you would remind us to put our confidence in you and who you are, and that we have a strong foundation in the truth. I pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so chapter 16. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about what we talked about on Friday, where, well, at least the ending part of chapter 15, where basically Paul wants to do another missionary trip. He wants to go see some of the other churches that him and Barnabas planted in the past, like a couple of years. He wants to visit them. He wants to see how they're doing, and of course, also go to new places and do ministry. But unfortunately, at the time, Paul and Barnabas get into a little bit of falling out there, a little bit of argument, particularly about John Mark. The details aren't really told to us, but we could kind of assume based on the little bit that is told. And because of this, Paul and Barnabas split up, and they decide to go, their own ways in doing ministry. So Barnabas takes John Mark, and Paul takes a dude named Silas. And Paul and Silas are now going to go to different places to do ministry. So that's kind of where we are now. And chapter 16 kicks off with this new ministry adventure, if you will, of Paul's. Chapter 16. So Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Now Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he had him circumcised because the Jews who lived in the area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in faith and grew daily in number. Now Paul and his companions traveled through the region of Phrygia, that's how you say it, Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching in the province of Asia. Now when they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, I think that's how you say that. But the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. Now during the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Now from Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for, Samothrace, I forgot the T. Samothrace. And the next day we went to sorry, I lost my place there. The Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of the district of Macedonia, and we stayed there for several days. Hi, how the heck do you say that? All these names, man. Abdel Majid. I think that's how you say that. Abdel Majid? Hello and welcome. You have a question. I'm going to keep reading while you type down your question. Verse 11. From Troas we went out to sea and sailed straight from Samothrace, and the next day we went on to Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district, and we stayed there for several days. Now on the Sabbath, we went outside the city to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. Now one of these women, who was listening, was a woman from the city of Thyatira, named Lydia, a dealer of purple cloth. She was a worshipper of God, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her house were baptized, she invited us to stay at her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. Okay, you have a question. Okay, what is your question? I'm gonna keep reading while you type down your question then. Oh, this is a long one, so maybe I'll wait for it, because once we get to verse 16, I kind of have to read the entire story. So, and then it's kind of the end of chapter 16. But basically the first, well, I'll talk about the first half. And then we'll get to the second half of chapter 16, which is a pretty long story. So, first half of chapter 16. So, chapter 16 starts off with Paul beginning, "Why do I worship Jesus?" I mean, that is, I suppose that is the $64,000 question. And I mean, in our faith, we believe that. Let's put it this way. So, I've mentioned this many a times in my other videos, so you can always go look those up too. But basically, in the daily dredge of life, I guess you could say, and all the many ambitions we have, we all know that, you know, everybody lives and everybody dies. That's just the way it is. That's how the world has been since forever. And so, in the midst of that, I mean, you gotta wonder, well, then what is the point? And as we try to engage, and this is why, you know, religion exists. It's kind of the question of, well, why do we bother when it's all going to end anyway? And so many a religion has tried to answer, how do we continue on, you know, knowing that in this life it's all basically meaningless. And that's kind of what the book of Ecclesiastes is. I mean, that's his whole shtick, right? But Jesus comes along, and, you know, many a religion has tried to answer this question, and, you know, they all had good takes. But what makes Jesus stand out is not so much just stuff he says, but in the primary act of what is the foundation of Christianity, and that is that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, this is the most important doctrine in Christianity, primarily because it changes that entire dynamic. That we don't just live to die, basically. And the way that I word it on many of my other videos in regards to who Jesus is that as Jesus rose from the dead, it means that since Jesus lives, then we can truly live. Because everybody dies, but does everybody truly live? That's the real question that needs to be asked. And so, as Jesus rose from the dead, proving that everything else he says is true, including all his claims to be the Son of Man, a divine title, by the way, that he is, in fact, the Son of Man, the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, as well as the true face of God, if you will. Okay, my question is, have you tried to read the Quran? It's been a while since I've read it. Now, I know what you're going to say. Some people might get on my case because I've read a translation. I can only read in English. So, now, someone might say, well, that's not you have to read the Quran in Arabic in order to truly understand it. Of course, I have a criticism of that critique. and that is, it's problematic for a religion to claim that you must read its text in its original language. This downplays the ability of fidelity within analyzing text. And so a translator, see, and I know it was one thing to say, like, okay, well, human translators are human translators, and so they're not perfect. And people might assume that there might be some kind of, like, oh, some kind of intent to change text or whatever. But the danger of that is, well, then nothing is reliable. And at that point, then, we might as well just go back to caveman tribalism at that point, right? But I would make the claim that you can read any version of the Bible and the message is always pretty consistent and pretty clear in its consistency. And so, with that said, though, I will still make the case that it's been a while since I've read it, but I have read the Quran in a translation. It's been a while, though, and so you're making this whole claim that, like, well, to say that Jesus was only a messenger, but at the same time, Muhammad will contradict some of this stuff sometimes, where Muhammad does actually tell Muslims, if you're confused about stuff in the Quran, well, why don't you read the book? Of course, what he's referring to is the Bible, basically, when he talks about the people of the book. And so, if that is true, then we have to take what the Bible then says to be accurate. And if Muhammad's words are to be trusted in that regard, then what the Bible says can be trusted. Now, this is where you run into some arm wrestles, because other parts of the Quran may say things that are different from what the Bible will say. But so which is it? Is Muhammad's word reliable then? That Muhammad said, well, if you're not sure about certain things of the Quran, then read the Bible. And then the Bible will make claims about how Jesus has divine nature in the way he acts. And that's another thing too. And so, see, here's one of the things that when you mention, and a quick rebuttal to it would be when people say, well, Jesus was only a messenger. But it's not so much are his words are actually not as important as the stuff Jesus does. And so it's interesting because, yeah, a lot of the stuff Jesus says is important, and many people may be able to recite some of them pretty well, like the judge, don't judge lest you be judged kind of thing, words like that. But what makes Jesus stand out a lot more when you read through the Bible is that it's through what he does. And so, and it's also, as you read through the Bible, it's through what he does that implies a more divine nature, whereas where some people stick solely to just words, and this is a minor pitfall, honestly, of some Muslim scholars. A minor pitfall is that you focus too much on just stuff he says. And so I understand where some people say, like, oh, like Jesus never flat says that, oh, I am God worship. He never outright says that. But if you observe what Jesus does as you read through the Bible, he behaves and acts in a way that is more than human. And I would dare say he isn't human in some regard, in the way that he acts. And of course, the Bible's internal logic would be that he acts as if he is God. And so while Jesus may not flat out say that he's God, he certainly acts in a way that he kind of acts with that authority, is the word that the Bible uses a lot. He acts as if he has the authority of doing so. And of course, this is also why the Jewish authorities hated Jesus so much. That's the real reason why the Jewish authorities hated him so much, is because Jesus was going around acting as if he was God. Okay, I'm reading those passages, but Okay, so you're just giving me platitudes. Anyway, we're gonna. So that was I think that's a way of answering your question of why we worship Jesus, because he, in the resurrection, we can truly live, and that in his resurrection he proves all his other claims, especially in his behavior, about him being God. And so in in the resurrection we have the security of life and the promise of life and life everlasting, because of course, we are all aware of like the mortal life and then like dying after that. That's just normal. but but of a new life that transcends death, not just in the afterlife, but even as we live in this life, an empowered life, then it is in that promise, that covenant, if you will, the new covenant, that is the promise of which we can truly live. And that is something that the Christian is at least supposed to, ideally, the Christian is supposed to be the beacon of that hope, that we live the resurrected life, and then we as Christian, we as followers of Jesus, we then conduct ourselves as if that actually mattered. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. I'm gonna keep reading from. Oh, we got a long one here, so actually, we're not gonna keep reading. I'm gonna talk about the first part of chapter 16 of the Book of Acts, and then we'll do the second part. The second part is pretty long, and so I kind of feel like I should do that part on its own, and so we're gonna leave that part till later. So the first part of chapter 16. So chapter 16 starts with Paul on his missionary adventures, I guess you could say, and it's interesting that once again the Book of Acts does this thing where we bring up characters, and the writer brings up these characters just so that like, oh yeah, like the original audience of the Book of Acts, they okay. So I've mentioned this so many times already in the Book of Acts, but basically the problem when as we read the Book of Acts as modern readers today, we are not as aware of the landscape, if you will, of how churches operated, who's who in the Christian world, and yada yada yada. Whereas, to put it this way, in the first century with these guys here like Paul, Peter, and all these guys, like all the audience of the Book of Acts all knew who these guys were and knew them in relatively good detail. And so from time to time, and I mentioned a few of them in the past, we had Barnabas especially being one of them, John Mark is another one. The original audiences of the Book of Acts knew who these people were. And now in chapter 16, we're introduced to another person that from us as a 21st century reader, we're like, oh, a new character enters the scene. But for the original audiences of Acts, it was more like, oh, you're telling us a little bit of the early life of someone we know very well. And one of those people would be Timothy. Now, a little bit of history of Timothy. Now, Timothy's quite an interesting character. I talked about him a little bit in last week's reading stream, where Timothy, I think what's great about Timothy is that when you read the book of Timothy and Paul writes a letter, like a swan song letter to him, basically is what it is. He writes him a swan song letter. we see a huge growth and evolution within Paul's attitude and his maturity, if you will. And so I think it's kind of interesting, and I kind of wish that we had read chapter 15 and 16 together, because you get to see this interesting parallel here, where chapter 15 ended with John Mark and this kind of outro of his character, as well as it's a reflection of Paul's character in regards to John Mark. But then we get Timothy, and Timothy is the beginning process of an evolution of Paul's downfall. Not downfall, that's not correct. A failing of Paul's character. So I guess I can talk a little bit more detail on it. So in chapter 15, when Paul isn't too happy about bringing John Mark along, then sorry, I lost track there for a second, because I read your comment and then I lost track of what I was going to say. Anyway, so Paul's moral failing, I guess, you could say, is that Paul wasn't willing to give John Mark a second chance, despite the fact that's kind of like the essential of Christianity, is all about having a second chance, about, being forgiven of your sins and being allowed to try again in life. And so Paul doesn't really give John Mark this mercy. He kind of, views John Mark as a little shit, basically. And Barnabas disagrees with him, and that's why they split. Well, Timothy shows up, and then Paul starts training up Timothy in the faith. Now, what's interesting about Timothy is that when we get to the book of Timothy, this is where I was going with it, by the way. The book of Timothy, Timothy is like the leader of a church by the time we get to the book of Timothy. And something that Paul tells Timothy, which is kind of interesting, especially in 1 Timothy, like verse 4, or chapter 4, sorry, not verse 4, chapter 4, where Paul encourages Timothy, hey, don't be discouraged, and don't let people look down on you because of your youth and your somewhat inexperience. Don't let people look down on you. And so, with that said, what's interesting about that is it's a huge difference from how Paul once viewed John Mark, basically the same way that Paul is encouraging Timothy not to be viewed in the same way, which which some people might be quick to say, like, well, that's hypocritical. How could Paul tell Timothy, to not let people look down on him, when that is exactly what he does with John Mark? Well, first of all, you have to look at one of the important elements of the story, time being one of them, and time changes people. And so, when you look at it like that, then the beauty of the book of Timothy is we see Paul's maturity quite a bit. Now, I bring this up being as somewhat important, especially when we're going back to the book of Acts now, is that the original audiences of the book of Acts would have known this was kind of going down. And so, Parson back from eating, I know, right? But anyway, so as I read through the book of Acts, and you read the end of chapter 15, how can we? I know. Sorry, I didn't address you right away, Heavenly Faith. I'm trying to go through this whole thing with Paul and Timothy here, and then I'll get to you in a bit. But anyway, so what's great about this kind of bridge between chapter 15 and 16, and how I think, and this is, once again, take this with a grain of salt, this is more like me conjecturing here, but what the Bible was getting at was how we ended chapter 15 with a certain, like, Paul was in a certain stage of his life and in his ministry and his spiritual maturity, and he was in a particular stage at chapter 15. And yeah, Paul was a super bright guy, and he was really good at, convincing lots of Jews through the scriptures why Jesus was the Messiah, and he was really good at that. And he had quite the skill, apparently, as lots of people were led to believe because of Paul. But even though he was quite the intellectual, he still lacked a little bit of heart. I think that's kind of what chapter 15 was showing us. Despite, Paul's earlier passion in the beginning of chapter 15, where he was very, adamant on protecting Gentiles from being forced to perform Jewish rituals in order to be proper Christians. And so, yeah, Paul could be more, Paul appears like very idealistic, but he still lacks a little bit of heart in his personality. And that kind of came out when he looks down on John Mark, basically, and views him as kind of like, oh, you're just some punk. But Timothy is kind of there to serve as the vehicle of which Paul begins to mature in spiritual life. And it is very possible, especially when you read through some of the letters of Paul, especially when you read through like 2 Corinthians, you read through Ephesians, Paul's maturity, he matures quite a bit. And he's changed quite a bit in his attitude. And he's a lot more compassionate toward individuals, as opposed to like Christian concepts as ideas. And, to be fair, every Christian has to go through that kind of process. It's easy to be like, well, the Bible says this, so we should do that. It's one thing to kind of think that way. But it's another thing to really be, and many Christians use this language nowadays of like living compassionately for the lost. And so Paul he's not quite there yet in his mindset, at least at the end of chapter 15. And introducing Timothy in the beginning of chapter 16, it reminds the original audiences of Acts that, yes, we all must go through this kind of growth process, and we will, and talk a little bit about Paul's growth process. And of course, the audiences would have been a lot more aware of this. And I'm just kind of assuming certain things about how old, people who are long since dead think. So, once again, take what I say, like, it's really more of a theory that I have of why these chapters are the way they are. And how I would extrapolate this from a sermon perspective would be like, once again, the Christian theme of second chances. And so Paul, another thing that makes Timothy an interesting character is that Timothy also is a reflection of how Paul has a second chance at being forgiving. Because at first, Paul doesn't appear all that forgiving. But Timothy acts as a kind of vehicle for that to occur. Of course, the other problem is that we don't see it in the book of Acts, and the book of Acts doesn't tell us this. Most of this kind of thematic growth in Paul's character is more implied as we read through all of Paul's teachings, as well as the book of Timothy. And this is more implied than flat out said in the book of Acts. Because the book of Acts will not flat out say it, because of course the book of Acts kind of doesn't have the time to do that. And of course the book of Acts writes about earlier times than the times of the letters and the book of Timothy. The book of Acts' purpose is merely to talk about and kind of give like the highlights, if you will, of the growth of Christianity. Even though, yeah, Paul does take center stage for a while, that's the primary theme of the book of Acts is still how Christianity grew and expanded beyond just being some kind of Jewish cult, but actually became a cultural phenomenon, movement, if you will, that not only existed within Israel, but transcended to not just the Roman Empire, but throughout the world. As we have seen today, Christianity is still, going strong because the apostolic tradition has carried itself through since the book of Acts. Anyway, So moving on with chapter 16, let's just skip the rest of the whole Timothy thing. There's like the whole weird thing about like while Paul didn't care that much about Gentile believers being circumcised, apparently it was made a deal with Timothy and that Timothy had to be circumcised, probably being a teenager or an adult, which would have sucked for an adult. That sounds horrible. I mean, every guy cringes and flinches a bit about the prospect of sharp and pointy things near their junk. And if you flinched a bit there, you have every right to be because that's a freaky idea. Timothy was a Samaritan. Uh, Not necessarily. Timothy. See, okay, so heavenly. The thing about the word Samaritan, and I talked about this in the Luke reading. Can't remember which week it was, but it was obviously the week with the Good Samaritan story. And the word Samaritan itself was actually kind of like a racial slur in that Jews used because Jews didn't want to acknowledge half Jews as Jews, and so they used the word Samaritan to say like, oh yeah, you're part Jewish, but you're also like half garbage, and so kind of like that's kind of like basically the best way to interpret the word Samaritan itself would be like just saying like half breed, you mixed mutt. I guess is a better. It's like saying calling someone a mixed mutt. Of course, that would, if you actually said that to someone, that would be extremely offensive. Like it sounds cute, like a mutt, like a crossbreed dog. It's kind of cute, but if you called a person that, well, shit, like you're that. Don't come crying at me when someone punches you square in the face because you called them a mutt. So that was basically like that's the best way to interpret the word Samaritan is that it's you're a Jewish mutt, which is which is actually just designed to be very condescending because it divides the purebreds and the not so the mixed blood people. And so an example of this actually, I knew a guy who was, I can't remember exactly what he was, but that sounds terrible when I say it that way. But he's half indigenous, like First Nations, and then he's half, I can't remember. I think he's like Jamaican or something. And he had a really hard time growing up. And of course, one of the issues is that he wanted to get involved in like indigenous rights movements and stuff like that, and solidarity in, like, for example, in Canada we have a huge deal about like reconciliation with First Nations, and this guy, he wanted to he wanted to really be a part of that. He wanted to be able to help and stuff like that, but at the same time he wasn't accepted because he may be like half, I can't remember what particular. He was born in BC, so he's probably Salish. He was half Salish and then he was half Jamaican. But he's not a real Salish because he's not 100% Salish. He's half Salish. And so he wasn't actually accepted as a real First Nations person, which when you think about it objectively, you're like, what the actual shit, right? Like that's such a scumbaggy thing to say to someone, right? Is that, oh, you're not real Salish because you're only half. Like, this, when you think of it out loud like that, it's kind of like, wow, I can't believe people are such assholes. But people actually think like that, and even though we live in the 21st century and we think we're beyond things like racism, unfortunately that's far from true. Especially when you think of like these activist groups actually look down upon people who are only half ethnicity, and that's not even the half of it. Wow, all puns intended, I guess. But that's not even the half of it because, of course, there's not just like being, let's say, for example, First Nations in your blood. Well, you have to think like a colonized person, and then there's, of course, that's where the Uncle Tom's term come in. If you don't know what that is, Uncle Tom is basically a black person or person of color, if you will, that thinks like a white person in the sense of, like, let's say, a popular example of an Uncle Tom. I'm okay. If I get deleted off YouTube because of this, well, whatever, it can't be helped. But a good example of an Uncle Tom are, for example, a lot of African Americans who vote Republican. And the reason why they're viewed as Uncle Toms is because even though they may be black by skin color, they don't think black, whatever the hell that means, right? And so they don't think black. And so then you're less of a black person, however that works, right? But like when you say it out loud like that, you start realizing how ridiculous this is. But people actually think this way. And you think of like, and why people quickly figured out like Black Lives Matter was bullshit was because despite they're like, oh, I mean, I guess they're true to their name. It's all about black lives. And so if you're not black, like the way they view what a black person should be, well, you're not black. And if you were, let's say, an African American that thought differently from how they do, they don't view you as black, which is ridiculous. Which sounds ridiculous on paper. It's like no, and like I thought you were black because of your skin color. I mean, I don't want to sound mean about that, but like no, that's what makes you black by racially. But maybe if people thought for longer than 5 seconds, maybe race isn't the most important part of who you are as a person, right? Because we all have something called a personality. But anyway, that's an example of kind of going back to the whole Samaritan thing. I know we went kind of the long trail, but it's kind of hard to make a comparison of Samaritan today. But even then, I know I've known people who are like they're half Caucasian and they're half something else. And then, of course, unfortunately in our culture, since white people are looked down upon because they're the oppressors and the colonizers, right? Like, I knew a guy who was half Japanese and half Caucasian, and man, people gave him so much shit growing up because he was half white and half Japanese, and so like he had severe like mental problems and because of the amount of like bullying he went through. And then the worst part is when you're half and if you're, let's say, half Japanese, half white, like this guy was, then he wasn't accepted by white people because he was partly Asian, but he wasn't accepted by Japanese people because he was white. He was also white, so like you lose both. Like you get nothing good out of it, and that was kind of the same deal that the Samaritans had to deal with in the Bible, and that's why, ironically, in that Good Samaritan story, Jesus uses the Samaritan as the hero of the story, because once again, it's not about your race and stuff like that. It's about who you are as a person and do you live God's commands. Be a good neighbor was the point of the case in that story, but you get the idea. The Samaritan in the story is viewed as the hero because he does what is right. Love your neighbor as yourself. So going back to Timothy, in a literal sense of when you take the word of Samaritan, after I've gone through that semi-racist expose of what the word Samaritan actually means, by that logic, yes, Timothy is a Samaritan because he's half Jewish and then half not Jewish, and so it is very possible that Jewish people look down on him, and that could very well actually be part of the reason, although the Bible never flat out says it, why Timothy was looked down upon when he assumed leadership roles in the church of Ephesus much later, as we read through the book of the letters of Timothy, or the letters to Timothy more accurately, but you get what I mean. And so, that's all the more reason why, like, it wasn't easy for Timothy because of stuff like that. We talk about like race and stuff like that, and that's another reason why. Once again, if you go back to Acts 15, it was a big deal that Gentiles would not be barred off from becoming Christians because Christianity wasn't about a ethno-binding nationalism, but rather Christianity was about salvation for all people. And that was kind of the main themes that the early church wanted to really get across. So that's why they dealt with the whole like, should new converts be circumcised? And the answer they decided was no, they don't have to be, because once again, it's about belief in Jesus that saves you. You don't have to follow all the ritual stuff in order to be saved. Because once again, ritualism, and I've talked about this quite a bit last week, so you can go watch that video. But basically, the rituals were representative of the national identity of a people as well. That separates you from, everyone else, basically. But Christianity tried to move away from that. Of course, there was some backslidings here and there, but that's human nature. So you can't really fault the philosophy of Christianity. But what the Christians were concerned about was, if we really believe that Jesus wants us to make disciples of all nations, then we have to really act like that is the case. And so we can't put up barriers that would prevent non-Jews from becoming Christians, which was the main reason why they had that whole thing, the whole council in Jerusalem in chapter 15. Okay, so continuing on in this analysis of the first half of chapter 16. Paul gets a dream from this dude in Macedonia. And this is one of those interesting things too, because once again, way earlier in the book of Acts, and once again, remember, the book of Acts takes a span of 25-ish years, give or take. And so, Paul's ministry trip is the later part of that 25 years that the book of Acts takes place in. But we gotta remember that in the early parts of the book of Acts, we had people who became Christians in Jerusalem when, Peter was now the Pope, I guess. And, the day of Pentecost where the Holy Spirit came upon him and the other apostles as well. And then Peter gave his first sermon, and 3,000 people believed. Well, it was very possible that some of them were from Macedonia, and they had brought Christianity, even though it wasn't clearly that yet. They brought Christianity to their hometowns in Macedonia. And that would explain why, okay, we have this guy here in Paul's vision, his dream or whatever. And this guy's like, help us. And Paul's like, yes, I'm going to help you. And so, yes, weird telepathy through dreams. Because the Bible does weird things like that. But basically, it's basically what I'm getting at here is there shouldn't be any real mystery why there were believers already in Macedonia before Paul even got there. It's because, well, Peter already did the groundwork back in Jerusalem years prior. And of course now they need some updates, and they need these Macedonians need help, maybe establishing an official church or something, having more, having a system, a church system. Maybe they need those things and they don't have it. Because maybe, and think of it this way, as these first converts back in Acts chapter 2 would have gone back to their hometowns and then start spreading the gospel. Well, the gospel would, similar how it was in Jerusalem, it would have just appeared like a little cult. But now, a lot of these groups wanted to become organized and institutionalized, I guess is a way of wording it. They want to become institutionalized. And so Paul is sent out to be the guy to help them out with that. So that's kind of the whole TLDR of the whole, how we should be reading that particular section of chapter 16, just as Paul has his dream of this guy and he's going to help this guy out. Then we have this other story of Lydia. I think she's in Troas. No, she's from a place. She's in one of the Philippines, because there's lots of Philippines. So she's from Philippi, and Paul meets a bunch of believers there, and Lydia is one of them. That's all it really tells you. What's interesting about Lydia, though, is that Lydia is rich. And so I guess she's kind of mentioned here to kind of explain questions the original audience and as well as modern readers, I'm sure, would have wondered about some of Paul's ministry financing, because going around church planting ain't cheap. Because it's not like you have a you have a steady. It's not like you as the missionary have a steady income, so you rely on the patronage of those you encounter and plant churches in their towns. And so I guess Lydia's story is kind of added to the book of Acts to kind of remind us that that was how ministry life was. But it's just a funny note that Lydia was loaded, because the Bible tells us that she was what was her job? A woman. Okay, she was a dealer in purple cloth. Now that sounds like okay, so she deals with like purple cloth. How does that make you like rich? Well, remember, this is the ancient world where getting the right dyes for clothes was not easy. And purple was one of those colors that, see, purple is not one of those colors that you can easily get the right dyes in nature. It was quite a complex process, because most flowers give either like blue. A lot of flowers probably give like all the primary colors. So you get a lot of, yellow, blue, and red. But some colors are easier to mix than others, because trying to mix red and blue, you might screw it up pretty easily. You might make it too blue or too red pretty easy. See, green is not that hard to screw up when it comes to dyeing like clothes. And of course, like finding the dyeing material was not easy for the color purple. And so you would have to find these rare plants and stuff like that. And so for Lydia to be a dealer, a trader of purple cloth would have mean that she had access to a lot of rare and essentially expensive items. Another thing too was, and if you notice in like movies, or you watch like a lot of movies that take place in like the Roman times, and only the wealthiest of people wore purple. Even like most like the politicians, the patricians, as they were called. The patricians often wore red. Now, red was already pretty hard to get as a cloth color, and so when the politicians would wear them, it showed that they had status, because red was not easy to get either. But if you were wearing purple, like you were the top. You were at the top, because purple was so rare in the ancient world when it comes to dyes, and so people would obviously, if people were able to wear purple, it showed that they were of the highest class. This obviously translated into the medieval period, and that's why you think of like in the medieval period, purple was the color of royalty, because once again there was that thinking, since purple dye was rare compared to all the other dyes, then you were like the shit basically if you were wearing purple. And so that was clearly, they clearly would put that into the royalty, because the royalty were the top dogs of your society back then. So for Lydia to be a person who does like tailoring and stuff like that in purple cloth would have meant that she would have only dealt with the best and the richest people. And so by extension, she would have made some mad bank, because she only dealt with super rich people. I'll tell you a funny story, actually. So when I was a security guard, like years ago, there was one place I did security guard for, and this job was like, this is one of the few parts of security work that I actually liked, because it was super easy and kind of super chill. Because of course, like you wouldn't have, people causing trouble here, because there would be no way, like, some guy off the street would enter this store. So it was an Italian wear store, and if you know anything about Italian wear, like Italian wear is like the shit. It's like the finest leathers. They use like nothing but pure silk in some of their material. Like it is the up there. If you're wearing Italian wear, Like you were the top of society. That it's where the 1% shops basically. Dude, I tell you, one suit in this store. You bought one suit, dude. It was like 10, like on the low end, it was like 8K for a suit in this store. Now you think, why the hell would you have to do security at a store like this? Because basically my job, my security job there was basically just to watch the door to make sure bums didn't come in, kind of thing, and try anything. And so basically my whole job was to man the door. And so when you're manning the door of a store like that, you can be pretty selective who comes in and who comes out. And so if you saw, like, let's say some guy in, like, you know, complete rag shows up at the door, you're not going to let him in. So the security work was relatively easy in a place like that. And I actually liked the place because the people that worked there were really nice too. They were pretty chill people. But the store itself, it was such a crazy store because like everything there was so expensive. And you know, the suits go for like minimum 8K. You look at like, the accessories, you're like, dude, how much the sunglasses cost here? I looked at one pair of sunglasses, like $300. Oh my goodness, $300 for a pair of sunglasses. They had like a shirt there, like a dress shirt there, was like almost $1,000. I'm like, dude, that's more than how much I make in a week here for a single shirt. Like, damn, bro, like that kind of wear, right? Like that is probably like that's the modern equivalent of what Lydia's job was, and so she was kind of like a person who, you know, sold these kind of clothes. And so imagine being like imagine being the manufacturer for stores like that. Like you got to make some mad bang. And so no doubt that like Paul meeting Lydia was like a huge boon in his ministry because damn, you know, he's got a sugar mama right there. Because she is clearly loaded. But yeah, funny stories about my security work. Yeah, so this shop was pretty cool, but going in there just felt so awkward because I had to wear a suit, but my suit is like what, a $400 from Mex, like whatever, right? $400 suit. In comparison, it looks like chump change, right? So I'm wearing this like chump change, you know, like suit to work. But all these other guys, you know, they're all like in these nice Italian wear, dude. I was like, man, I wish I could get my hands on Italian wear because that's something. It ain't cheap. And then you see like people coming. The crazy part is you actually see people coming to the store, and they actually buy stuff. Like every other week, there was this like old Chinese guy who would walk in, and he would buy a belt from the store like every few weeks. Because I did security work at this place for quite a while. Every few weeks, I would buy a belt. The belts cost like $400, $500 each. So basically, every month he spends about $1,000 on belts, and that's not even including the odd time he buys some shoes. So like, yeah, damn, you know, that's like more money than I make in a month. Just like, right? And people, and there are people who have money like that, right? You know, yours truly not being one of them. But there are people with that kind of money. It just shows like, dang, you know, like that's what it means to be rich when you can go to an Italian wear store and buy stuff like that. You wouldn't catch my poor ass going in there on a normal day. Yeah, that is upset. It is crazy when you think about it. You're like, damn, it's a lot. That's a lot of money just moving around like that. My poor ass though, you wouldn't catch me dead. So, just a funny story about rich people, I guess you could say. But Lydia was one. You know, imagine being the manufacturer for a store like that. Like that was Lydia's job basically, and that would have made her some pretty good money. It is very possible, since the Bible only mentions Lydia in this chapter for this one little instance. This is where, once again, there's more of that hinting that, like, you know, we run into this problem as modern readers. We don't know much else that the average listener and the average audience member of who the book of Acts would have been addressed to, they would have known Lydia pretty well. Like, her name would have flown around quite a bit. And so these people would have been known. But to us as modern readers, we just get these little excerpts of like, oh yeah, and Paul met Lydia here, and Paul met Timothy here, and Paul met this dude over there. And so while the Bible, as we read it as text, just kind of acts that way, like, oh, Paul met this person and that person and so on. The book of Acts' audience would have had a much more in-depth knowledge of who these people were. And the fact that we cannot get more than that, since most of those records we don't really have. So you just have to like deal with it, and the limited information that the Bible gives us, you just got to deal with that. That's all the Bible can give you. We aren't the original members of the book. We aren't the original audience of the book of Acts. So you just kind of have to accept that, like, there are things you're just not going to know. The funny thing is, when Paul gets to Macedonia, not much else is said about Paul's time in Macedonia, aside from the whole Lydia meeting, which once again, I think, now this is more, once again, this is me conjecturing now, that maybe one of Lydia's primary roles in church history, if you will, she might have been the main financial backer for the church in Macedonia. Because we do know, when we get to I can't remember which book it is. I want to say in Titus, the book of Titus, or a letter to Titus. But in the book of Titus, the Church of Macedonia is brought up a little bit, because it is very likely that Titus went to go minister there and may have become like a bishop there. But clearly, by the time we get to Titus, once again, on the tail end of Paul's life, the Church of Macedonia is actually a thing. And so it is very possible that the Lydia story is tied with Paul going to Macedonia, because it's just, Occam's razor would just have you assume that maybe Lydia was the primary financial backer of the Church of Macedonia. Even though he did have to go to Philippi to meet her, but it's weird that they would just kind of treat, like, Paul just passes by Macedonia and then we talk about Lydia. I think it's kind of weird that the Bible just does that. So my assumption is that, well, maybe Lydia was just the financial backer of the Church of Macedonia. And that's kind of why her story is linked to Paul passing through Macedonia. But I don't got much else for you other than that. I can tell you much else, because we don't know. The book, the early audience of the book of Acts would have known, but it's something that us as 21st century readers could not know. And yeah, there's many Bible scholars that have made guesses, and a lot of them are the same as mine. So what I'm saying to you is not original information anyway. Plagiarism. No, I'm just kidding. But once again, these are just like assumptions that every Bible scholar would make, because what else do you have to go on? Not much else. So I mean, you just gotta deal with it, I guess. Okay, so we're gonna continue the narrative with verse 16 of chapter 16. Oh, that totally was not planned. But we're gonna continue on with verse 16 to the end of the chapter. It's a long story, so we'll probably end today's reading stream. It is gonna be a shorter one. It's just the way it is, but we'll just read the rest of chapter 16 and kind of end it there. Because, once again, we get to chapter 17, and guess what? That one's a long one, too. So, woo! All these chapters start getting really, like, meaty, I guess is the word you could say. But, anyway, I'm rambling at this point. Alright, verse 16. So once, when we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune-telling. She followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God." who are telling you the way to be saved. She kept this up for many days. Now finally, Paul became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the spirit, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." At that moment, the spirit left her. When her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. Now they brought them before the magistrates and said, "These men are Jews, and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice." Now the crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped down and beaten with rods. Now, after they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet to the stocks. Now about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself, for we are all here." The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell. The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell, trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." When they spoke the word of the Lord to him, and to all others in his house, at that hour of the night the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and his household were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. When it was daylight, the magistrates sent their officers to the jailer with the order, "Release those men." The jailer told Paul, "The magistrates have ordered you that you and Silas are to be released. Now you can leave. Go in peace." But Paul said to the officers, "They beat us publicly, without a trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. And now, do they want to get rid of us quietly? No, let them come themselves and escort us out." The officers reported this to the magistrates, and when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, they were alarmed. They came to appease them and escorted them from the prison, requesting them to leave the city. After Paul and Silas came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met with the brothers and sisters and encouraged them. And then they left. Alright, so this story is a bit of a doozy, so we gotta take it beat by beat here. So first we have Paul and Silas walking around in Philippi, and they encounter a fortune teller. Basically, is what she is. And they encounter a fortune teller, and it's interesting because on the one hand, the fortune teller, she actually accurately describes who Paul and Silas are. But at the same time, it's pretty clear that Paul doesn't want to be associated with her. And, well, not so much her, but more like the demon in her that he doesn't want to be associated with. And so, which, by the way, explains the question of why, people would ask the question, well, why would Paul exorcise this woman when she, in a way, she could actually, since she's accurately describing Paul and telling people how they could actually be saved and become believers in Jesus, well, why would then Paul, exorcise the spirit out of her. Isn't the spirit helping? But I think the risk would be associating yourself with, you know, other spirits like that, you know, they may claim to be on your side, but who knows what other intentions they might have. And I think there's a kind of a little bit of a parallel here with Paul and this fortune teller, and of course Peter and Simon the sorcerer. And so once again, there's this not desiring to really associate with people of much more selfish gain, if you will. Because once again, think of it this way. So what the Bible tells us is that this woman was the primary income for some of these like kind of shady dudes. Now we could go the really weird route and talk about how like there's a bunch of dudes that own this woman, and she's the way that they make money. Yeah, real shifty when you word it that way. But basically, since this woman was their primary source of income, another good reason of why Paul would exorcise the spirit out of the woman is that it's not just her and the demonic spirit that Paul doesn't want to be associated with, but rather something that every Christian needs to be extremely mindful of is how you associate with people with selfish gain. And so imagine, let's just hypothetically say that imagine that Paul doesn't exorcise this woman. He doesn't cast the spirit out of her. And so let's say this woman goes around continuously saying, hey, you know, these guys are servants of the Most High God. They know how you can be saved. And then people go, okay, how can we be saved? And then Paul tells them, as he would normally say, you know, believe in Jesus and then you can be saved. And then awesome, you know, more people come to the faith. That's what, you know, people think, well, that'd be a good thing, right? But then these shady dudes would come up and say, oh, remember when the fortune teller said that these guys would tell you how to be saved and now you're all believers? Well, that was all because of us, right? They could have pulled that. These guys could have pulled that kind of thing off. Be like, oh no, that was because of us. That we allowed this Christianity to grow in this city because it was our girl that, you know, told you. So you owe it to us, and then we're gonna exuberate tons of money out of you because remember, these guys are pretty shady and all they care about is money. And so we know that these guys all they care about is money because let's go back to reality, where after Paul exorcises the demon out of this girl, or the spirit out of this girl, they get really mad because since the girl no longer has her magic powers, they can't make money. And so what do? They get Paul and Silas brought to the center of town and have them beaten, have them beaten with rods. And so, you know, clearly these guys were not happy. And it makes sense that to assume that all these guys cared about is money. That makes sense to think that, because why else would they act this way? And so, if you read within the context itself, I think that's the easiest assumption of why Paul definitely did the right thing from expelling the spirit from this girl. Because not just from a spiritual battle perspective, which I know many Christians fall back on that discussion, which is, I mean, you're not wrong. But I think also from just within the text itself, and we look at other factors aside from just everything being a spiritual battle, similar to the whole, and I think there's parallels here. I draw this parallel with the story of Paul here, with the story of Jesus and Legion. A quick recap of Jesus and Legion. Basically, the story goes down like this. So Jesus and his disciples, they go to some place called the Gerasenes, which means it's a non-Jewish place. And when they get there, there's a demoniac, a dude who's like possessed, and he's got like superhuman strength and stuff like that. And Jesus stops this person, and he's like, well, actually, before he stops him, the demon stops, actually. The demon stops himself. And he goes, whoa, it's you. are you here to torture us before the appointed time? And then Jesus goes, leave this man. You have no right to be here. And then the demon goes, well, if that's the case, well, let us go into the pigs then. And then Jesus allows that to happen, which is also kind of a weird thing in itself, where Jesus allows the demon, who calls itself Legion, to enter like these 2,000 pigs. So I guess they're dual legion. The demon's name should be dual legion because he's 2,000 spirits, something like that. But besides the point. Anyway, I'm just being weird there. Ignore that. Anyway, so after Jesus drives out this demon, and the demons go into these pigs, and the pigs run to the river and they drown themselves. Because I guess the demons rationalize that drowning themselves is a lot better than facing torment from God. Which, I mean, understandable. That is a completely rational thought. Demons making sense. Who'd have thunk? But anyway, after Jesus casts out this demon, then the townspeople, they freak out, and they want Jesus to leave immediately. And of course, many a Bible scholar, and I think it's pretty unanimous, you'd have to be kind of out there in your thinking to think something different, but the reason why the people wanted Jesus out of the town was because Jesus was a major threat to their economy. Because, I mean, to be fair, Jesus had a demon possess 2,000 pigs and have them drown. And so, since this is not a Jewish place, the pigs would have always been part of a pig farm, which means, a high amount of food. Imagine how many Chinese restaurant meals that is. But anyway, 2,000 pigs is a huge economic blow that Jesus does to these people. And so the people are like, no, get out of here. We don't want you here. Which is actually scary about the people's priorities, because they cared more about their economic stability than the life of a demoniac who is now cured. Because remember, the story also tells you that the demoniac was a huge problem for them. He would doesn't he make loud noises at night? So he keeps the town up at night. He beats the shit out of people who cross by, so he's clearly a menace, and he's clearly like a physical threat. He cuts himself, so all the he's probably got blood all over the place, which is very dangerous on hygiene, and possibly spreading like blood diseases and crap. Like, this guy was clearly a huge problem, but the people cared more about their economic stability than they cared about this guy's life, and their lives for that matter, in regards to the Bible tells us that they tried that because he was such a menace. They tried chaining him, but apparently he had superhuman strength, so he would break them anyway. That's why they chained him, because he was a problem. He was a very big problem, as a matter of fact, for all the reasons I mentioned, and then some. There were probably other things too that I'm not thinking about right now, but he was clearly a problem. But the fact that Jesus heals him is not even on these people's radar. They're more concerned about their economic stability, because the demon killed 2,000 pigs, which would have been a huge economic blow. And so the parallel between the Jesus and Legion story, that is sad. They cared more about economic stability than the man. Well, I mean, the sad reality is, Heavenly Faith, is that is just part of human nature. That's still something that exists today. And you have all the wars between capitalism and socialism, and why they're both wrong in their own reasons. It's because it's not about people. It's all about money and the control of money. Socialism claims to be like for the people, but not really. It's just trying to change people's economic priorities. Whereas capitalism is all about prioritizing the accumulation of wealth. And so both of those things are wrong for their own reasons. And what you say is true. It's that people cared about the economic stability. In both systems, it's only about that. It's never really about the people, despite, the whole thing about capitalists will argue that people are free to choose. But, of course, the problem with that logic is human beings will often pick shitty choices, which is why the economy goes downhill under capitalism. It's because people will always pick the wrong choices. People will always pick things that are hedonistic. And so while on an individualistic level, oh, there's you're more liberated in the fact that your money is used the way you want it to. But on a societal level, the danger comes in that we exploit each other because that's what humans do. And capitalism allows you to do that. And you can justify it by saying money allows me to do it. I can buy the ability to exploit you. So that's the flaw with capitalism. The flaw with socialism would be that when you change the priorities of how economics works, then it becomes a power struggle, not just with money, but with other things like race, class, etc. Basically bringing back older ways of thinking. And so, because of course, when people talk about like, oh, socialism and redistributing the wealth, then the natural question would be, who gets to decide that? And then you elect people based on trivial things. But once again, you can't trust, no human being can be trusted with that kind of power. How does the old saying go? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if you gave people that power to be in control, to be in control of how wealth is distributed, obviously those people are going to abuse it. That's exactly what happened with Cuba and every other socialist regime. Weren't there laws for Israelites to share their accumulated harvests to the poor people, or like a fraction or something? Yeah, there were some laws about that, but once again, it's one thing to say they had the laws; it's another thing to say people actually followed them. And that was, you read like the book of Amos, one of my favorite books in the Bible, because Amos has got to be like a hilarious ass dude. And what's great about the book of Amos is that like, and I share a kindred spirit with him in the sense that like, dude, people would have hated it. People would hate me just as much as the early Israelites would have hated Amos, because Amos had quite the mouth on him. He had no bars, that dude. But anyway, the book of Amos, one of his major themes, and I talked about this a little bit, I think in one of my philosophy streams, not a Bible reading one, but one of my philosophy streams, I talked about how what makes Amos pretty great is that, in my opinion, why I like him so much, is that one of Amos's main themes is about people, God wants us to be humane to each other. And so Amos's major complaint, he's voicing God's complaint with his colorful spin, if you will, that the people of Israel were not being humane. And so he uses extreme language to show how inhumane people are. A little bit of funny trivia, actually. In the Hebrew, the closest thing to the F word is actually used in the book of Amos. In our English translation, this is toned down, quote unquote toned down. But then you read the passage, you're like, dude, it actually sounds kind of worse when you try to tone it down. The passage in question. I should actually have this one on hand. Like, I should tell you, like, Amos, whatever it is. But the passage itself is the part where he talks about, and the actual quote Amos uses is, father and son go into the same girl. Or they goes into the same girl. Of course, it's a euphemism that basically treating her like a sex object. And the Hebrew word there actually is the word where we get the word fornicate, but a lot more rude. And so in actuality, it's probably the closest thing to like using the F word in its literal meaning. And Amos is the prophet who does it. So yeah, you're probably like, and the point of that passage and the point of Amos using such extreme language, the fact that he would drop an F-bomb basically in the Bible, it's in the Bible, so it's there. Except once again, in our translations, we tone it down with the father and son going to the same girl. The fundamental idea is that it shows how dehumanizing men were treating women, and there are other examples of this too, of how people were just absolutely horrible to each other. And so, what you said about the people care about money more than they care about people, well, clearly, Clearly, there's even parts where they're like, what, a child is sold for like a bottle of wine? Like what the? You're thinking like what the shit, right? And Amos actually brings up that is one of the things that people did. They would actually like traffic children basically and child slave labor just to have a bottle of wine. Like that's so messed up. But people did that, and Amos was in the book of Amos. His whole thing is that God was really mad at Israel that they were doing this to each other, and how dehumanizing that the people of Israel had become. That is bad. Never read Amos. To be fair, a lot of people don't read Amos because once again, he's like, the modern like Christian person, the modern Christian, we made the joke about like the Karens. So your modern like Christian Karen would be clutching her pearls, reading the Book of Amos every few sentences. Like the Book of Amos is like really serious, and it just showed like the depravity of human beings. That was the whole point of that book, and how mad God was at Israel, and that I mean I guess God must have been so mad that he didn't put a filter on his prophet. That's how mad God was. I mean you could think of it that way, which actually that I mean that's pretty scary. You think of it like that. Like God is so mad that he doesn't even put filters on his prophet. And his prophet just like Amos just goes to town on people, talking about how terrible they are and using very colorful language to do so. But what makes it even to not I'm not trying to scare you, but like what makes it really scary as well is that like you can see the same kind of things in the world today, and that is exactly what you know these and on the one hand it shows like that's how human beings are, and no matter how how's the old saying go, no matter how much things change, things stay the same. And so, unfortunately, human beings in our depravity and our evil, we will keep committing these kind of evil acts. It is unfortunately the way, and the pastor in me would say, well, that's all the more reason we need Jesus to transform all of us, because if we are left to our own devices, well, then that's exactly what's gonna happen, right? And we've already seen this kind of depravity destroy the world multiple times. People do get mad when preachers use colorful language when discussing the depravity in this world. I mean, once again, there is something called tact, which is why you don't hear a pastor use colorful language at the pulpit. There is something called tact. Amos not known for it, but at the same time, sometimes you have to use extreme cases to kind of prove a point. And that's kind of what I do on the streaming Parson as well. I do that for like emphasis purposes. I'm not being offensive for the sake of being offensive. But I think sometimes people need that wake up call where it's like, no, you have to actually see how bad things are, and you have to use the extremes because, of course, like not just in religion, but you could use like mythology in general does this. This is the point. The point of mythology is to use extremes to tell a point. And I mean, other religions had this figured out, right? You use extremes to tell a point. I mean, it's still a practice we use today to an extent, using the idea of using extremes to tell a point, right? I've talked about this, and I know I shouldn't sidetrack too much. I'm supposed to be reading through the chapter 16. This is why we can only do one chapter this week, because I keep doing this. But you think of like Japanese anime and manga. Now, it's no secret to anyone, I'm a huge fan of like manga, and like one of the best manga I've ever read is My Dress Up Darling. Not just because of recency bias, it's just that good. But My Dress Up Darling is a great example of like the characters are so ridiculous. Like they're kind of out there, and the point is that they show extremes of it shows an extreme of like a gender reverse of the typical guy girl story. So Kitagawa, the woman of the story, acts as the dude in the story. She's the male character in the story, and Gojo is the female character. of course, there's the whole like, um, and I talked about this in one of my podcasts about not changing history, where I talked about the Seven Dwarves movie and the Peter Dinklage thing. But anyway, go look at the podcast. We have a playlist. Go check it out. But anyway, in that video, I talked about how, of course, a major part of the story is that Kitagawa awakens the masculine energy in Gojo, and Gojo awakens the feminine energy in Kitagawa. But at the same time, the reason why we love that, like manga artists pump out like the same romance comedies with the same tropes is because, well, one, it correlates with real life. People actually are like this. Of course, on the one hand, yes, manga rom-coms are relatable to everyday human life. But on the other hand, mangas are also kind of ridiculous in their nature. Like, they do take extremes. And of course, the point of the extremes is to tell a point, is to make it, well, part of it is entertainment purposes. But another reason is that it's to make a point. And so, using Kitagawa and Gojo as my examples. So, Kitagawa is like an extreme otaku. Like, she's like, you think you're nerdy as an otaku? You got nothing on Kitagawa. She is that nerdy. But the point is that Kitagawa is actually, she exemplifies something that all men do, and that is they use their quirkiness to hide how vulnerable they really are. I should do like a whole philosophy thing on that manga, because one, I love it, and secondly, I think it would be very interesting to actually dissect the story that way. But anyway, so Kitagawa, the girl of the story, actually behaves like most men do, in that she takes her quirkiness and she uses it as a big shield to protect who she really is. That she's very fragile. She's actually very, not fragile exactly. That's not the right word. But she does have her doubts, and she does have normal fears that most men go through. Which is weird to say, that she's the female character, but she's the one who goes through the fear that men have of rejection, and the fear of not having feelings reciprocated. And so, and this is what makes her great and why people love her so much, because she is the girl that reflects a man's life, basically. But the point I was getting at is that the extremes of her being an extreme otaku exemplifies her vulnerability that much more. It's to make that point that Kitagawa is actually quite vulnerable in her emotions, and that she's really good at hiding it because of how much of a nerdy otaku and cosplayer that she is. So the extreme otaku nature exemplifies her insecurities, and that it's great for the story. And then what also makes it great for the story is that it's something that's relatable to everybody. Of course, primarily from a guy's perspective, there's a huge relatability there. But then, of course, every guy should be introspective as they read that story and see, like, well, how do we do that in our hiding behind being basically man children? And that's, the extreme is meant to exemplify that. That was kind of the main point. The purpose of the extreme is to exemplify a point. And so I should probably come back to, talk about our Bible reading and why this is important. But with the book of Amos, the extremes were once again used to kind of exemplify the theological message of that God's wrath is not to be taken lightly. Which is a lesson our culture could use. Is that, the idea that God, we and this is where we talked about this in the past, Heavenly. I think you were in fact there. I talked about this in the past, but I think something that is lost in modern Christianity is that, yes, it is important to talk about the gracious nature of God and his forgiving nature in Jesus Christ. I mean, that is the crux of Christianity, obviously. But at the same time, I think some of the weight of that forgiveness is lost when we lose sight of, well, why do we need to be forgiven? Well, because we have sin, and God is very serious about sin, and that God will punish severely for the sin in our lives, which is all the more reason we need forgiveness. And so I think, going back to your point though, I think it's all the more true though, and I think that's what makes people kind of scared sometimes. And you know, I'm sympathetic. We should all be sympathetic to that. That yeah, it is scary that God has every right to be extremely mad, because you think of things like what you said about people caring about finances, and now we're gonna bring it back to our actual reading here. But you know, when we keep dehumanizing each other because we care about things like our personal comfort, our money, more than people. And that was a big part of where, you know, Jesus talks about, um, you know, you cannot worship both God and money, kind of thing. Because when you worship God, you actually care about people. When you worship money, you don't care about people, quite frankly. And so, you know, that's once again the complaint against capitalists that socialists use, and they forget to take the log out of their own eye because they do the exact same thing. But it's not a problem of ideology. It's a problem of dealing with the human nature, and that we are inherently selfish and greedy. And so, just like when Jesus had to deal with the people of the Gerasenes after expelling Legion from the demoniac, now we run back into the book of Acts. Yes, I did it, guys. I managed to pull myself back. We come back to the book of Acts, and that's kind of what's happening here. That Paul and Silas are mistreated because instead of people caring about how to be saved, how to get right with God, even a demon telling you this, how to get right with God, which sounds weird on paper, but you know, the spirit speaking to this girl actually tells him, hey, you can, you know, these guys have the message of how you can be saved, but the people don't care about that, especially these guys that rise up a mob. And that's the other thing too. That's weird, right? Because these guys were able to get a mob to do it. So it's not just these few individual guys that are like money hungry, you know, scumbags, even though they clearly are. It's not just them though. That's another part that makes it kind of scary. It's not just them. It's basically everybody, because that's how they were able to rile up this crowd. And then they all start, you know, beating Silas and Paul and treating them pretty badly and have them thrown in prison. And then of course there's the way that these guys cover up their greedy behavior is that, what do they accuse these guys of? They accuse them like, oh, these guys bring a foreign religion that is not our Roman ways. But I mean, I guess it's not inaccurate, because what would they have considered the Roman way? Live for yourself, make money however you can, including, you know, using a young slave girl, right? So I mean, I guess they're not incorrect in their accusation against Paul and Silas. And that people were so concerned about things like, you know, or let me put it this way. People were so inhumane in this story that they even, they just beat Paul and Silas anyway without even checking that they were Roman citizens. Now, of course, you know, you could play the race card here and say, like, well, they don't look like Italians, so I guess they're not Romans. Because remember, Paul and Silas are Jews. Silas may very well be like a Samaritan of some kind. He's not from like Israel. He's from like one of the other places in the diaspora, so he could very well be like half Jewish, half something else. But it doesn't even matter. The fact that they don't look Italian, these people treat them so inhumanely, they don't even check. Which brings up an interesting question in the story, which I'll jump to the end of the story and then we'll go backwards into the prison scene. There's actually a very interesting thing about this flogging moment that a lot of Bible scholars actually bring up in their commentaries about how, why didn't Paul and Silas bring up earlier that they were Roman citizens? Because it definitely would have saved them this ass whooping, that's for sure, that they got from the mob. If they had shouted, we are Roman citizens, they would have been fine. Because of course, you know, back then, I guess one thing Rome does have right is that they treat their citizens pretty well. Unlike other countries that I can think of today, easily can think of one off the top of my head. But anyway, at least one. But anyway, the big deal is that if you treated a Roman citizen badly, you could be executed, especially if you weren't a Roman citizen yourself. And then even Roman citizens mistreating other Roman citizens would have been treated like a big no-no, because like once again it goes in that whole like class elitism thing. Like if you were a Roman citizen, you were the top social class, so nobody should be like screwing with you. Was basically the idea. But the interesting thing that many Bible commentators bring up, and rightfully so, is why didn't Paul and Silas bring up that they were Roman citizens? Now, of course, one of the first objections that many people bring up of why they didn't bring up the fact that they were Roman citizens is because if they did bring up that they were Roman citizens, the trial would have ended, and then nothing would have happened. So this prison warden and his family would not have become, would not have been saved, would not have become Christians. That's the first answer that people give to that question. Why didn't Paul and Silas mention that they were Roman citizens? The only problem with this answer, it's actually a big problem, which is why I can't just take this answer at face value. The problem with this answer is that there's no way Paul and Silas would have known this. There is no way the Bible does not give us any hint that Paul and Silas were expecting to be rescued when they were in prison. They didn't expect that the prison guard would be so receptive to the gospel. They could not have expected this. They would not have known beforehand. Now, of course, some people might try to throw an objection to that objection by saying, well, maybe God told them beforehand. Which is, I guess, is a possibility because God can do anything. But going on scripture alone, I could not make that case. There's no reason that the Bible would ever suggest that. That Paul and Silas knew beforehand what was going to happen. So it would be hard to accept that they let themselves get the crap beaten out of them because they knew something good later was going to happen. They don't know this ahead of time. As a matter of fact, I also cannot accept the argument because this would contradict a later part in the book of Acts where Paul immediately brings out the Roman citizen card immediately. And he doesn't allow himself to get his ass whooped. He doesn't allow himself to get mistreated. So what gives? You would think that if it worked the first time, Paul would allow himself to be mistreated so that he could, do miracles and stuff like that afterward. But the Bible gives no actual account of that being that was actually what was going on. So we can't assume that being the case here. Another answer people give to why Paul and Silas don't actually reveal that they're Roman citizens. Now this one is really out there and is probably completely false. See, the first one just has problems, but the second answer people have just doesn't work, and that is that they basically lied that they were Roman citizens. This is a ridiculous answer because there is no way that would fly. If beating a Roman citizen is a major crime, you can imagine how much worse of a crime it is to lie that you were a citizen, considering everything I just talked about, how great it's supposed to be a Roman citizen, and the privileges that come with it, and once again, being the upper class of society. If you lied you were a Roman citizen, you could actually face the death penalty. So it would be not just unbeneficial to lie, it would actually be extremely dangerous to lie. And let's not even forget the theological implications of lying of being a Roman citizen, because then that would throw out the entire gospel message coming out of Paul and Silas's mouths. You could not trust anything that they said about the gospel if they lie about being Roman citizens. So this answer doesn't even remotely work. The first answer just has holes in it, that you have to assume things that the text doesn't tell you, and the text doesn't assume itself. This second answer just doesn't work. There's no way they would lie about being the Roman citizens. I've heard skeptics use that answer of like, oh, they lied that they were Roman citizens so that they could embarrass the magistrates. That makes no sense because embarrassing the magistrates is not a good enough benefit to putting your life in danger like that. Because yeah, you could say that you endanger everyone else's life, But if that happened, then obviously you'll get looked into, and then if you're not a Roman citizen, well, then you're the one who's way worse off because you will be executed. So the lying about the Roman citizen thing doesn't work. Now the third reason, I'm going to give you a third reason of why they didn't mention that they were Roman citizens. It's not that they didn't mention that they were Roman citizens, but rather people ignored that they were Roman citizens. And that, once again, it goes back to the depravity of human beings that we just talked about, which is why I went the whole, from the book of Acts to My Dress Up Darling and back, was to emphasize how depraved human beings can be, and that we can forget things like that. We can forget basic humanity because of things like our greed, our selfishness, and our own hedonism. We can deny people basic human decency. It is very possible that Paul and Silas more than likely mentioned that they were Roman citizens. But it's kind of hard to hear, people yelling, "I'm a Roman citizen," between the ows and the whippings and everyone else yelling, "Beat these guys." It's kind of hard to hear that, which actually makes more sense that that is probably what happened. It's also all the more reason when you read the ending part that Paul is actually upset that the magistrates just were going to be like, "Oh, we're going to let you out quietly." And Paul gets mad about it. Because it's one thing for Paul to say, "No, unacceptable. We're Roman citizens. You can't just tell us to go away." But for Paul to get mad about it, there must be more to it than that. And the answer I offer you, once again, this is more of a me really digging into the text and trying to nitpick at things here. So you gotta take it with a grain of salt. But this is because, once again, this is me nitpicking at things at this point. And also, like, the nitpicking is also a bit of like how I imagine things would actually go down, like imagining being there kind of thing. Is that Paul may have been like, "No, we tried to protect ourselves, and you denied us that. You are not getting away that easily." And that is how Paul. That's how you should read Paul's anger at the end of chapter 16. He's saying, "No, we tried to protect ourselves, and you denied us that. You have no right to kind of treat this like this is not a big deal." And that's why it's brought up that when Paul says, "We are Roman citizens, you have no right to treat us this way." And so, that just shows how badly, the magistrates listened to the mob, how bad the mob is, how bad everybody was towards Paul and Silas, is that they completely denied their humanity. And not just their humanity, but the fact that they were high class within the Roman culture. Because it makes more sense that really, Paul and Silas may have actually brought up that they were Roman citizens, but nobody heard them among the beatings that were happening. Which makes more sense, because once again, the other opinions that people have about why they didn't bring up the Roman citizen thing earlier, those answers don't work. One of them, once again, has plot holes. The other one is just flat out wrong. So the TLDR of those two answers was the theological idea that Paul used the opportunity to save the warden, his family, and help establish the church in Macedonia. Paul would not. My objection to this answer is that the plot hole appears that there's no way Paul would have known this beforehand. And so it wouldn't make sense to make the claim that Paul did know and then allowed it to happen. Because then you would run into the other problem, would be that Paul would violate other Roman laws, which puts his Roman citizenship in question. Which leads to the second answer, and why the second answer is flat out wrong, is that Paul possibly lied about it being a Roman citizen. This would make no sense whatsoever. Unlike the plot holes of the first answer, the lying about a Roman citizenship would just be like, it would make no logical sense for anyone to do this, especially considering all the dangers that came with doing that. You could be executed for lying about your Roman citizenship, and that is not a risk anyone would take, let alone a guy who wants to spread the truth of the gospel to the world. It's not something that would make sense to do. So the third answer I give of why, when people ask that question, why didn't they bring up the Roman citizens? Actually, you're asking the wrong question. Because that's not even a question. They did, in fact, bring up that they were Roman citizens, and nobody heard them. Because the people were more concerned about their own economic priorities and other personal selfish priorities, not just economic. But in the case of the story, economic is the first one in mind. And it even shows, my evidence is that it even shows at the ending where what the magistrates are so concerned about their reputation. So it implies that they knew something was wrong about this punishment. And they could very well have figured out that Paul and Silas could have been Roman citizens. So it's implied that they could have known. And how would they have known? They're not. We can't say the magistrates are mind readers. The obvious answer is that they heard it. And that they heard Paul and Silas already say it. But the Bible only brings it up later because now Paul has to say it again after being unheard the first time. So that is my answer to that question of when people ask why didn't Paul and Silas bring up that they were Roman citizens before. My answer is actually they did, and that people simply ignored them the first time. But the magistrates wanted to get around that to not embarrass themselves and possibly risk higher penalties. I.e., you could actually be executed for assaulting a Roman citizen like that. Because once again, Paul brings up that we were treated unfairly, there was no trial, etc. And Paul's anger comes out of the idea, or my theory, I guess I should say at this point, because it's more my theory, right? Paul's anger comes out of the fact that nobody heard him the first time, that he was in fact a Roman citizen, because it's safer to say that he did actually say it during the flogging, and that simply the mob didn't care, and the magistrates let the mistreatment happen, even though they could have heard it, because that leads to how they knew they had suspicions earlier that they were Roman citizens. And their suspicions came from probably the fact that they may have said it during the actual flogging. But it just shows how depraved that the people in Philippi were, that they ignored that. All right, let's talk about this prison story a little bit, though, and then we'll kind of end it because it's already 5 o'clock. So only one chapter today. It's just kind of how it be sometimes, right? But let's just finish chapter 16. So then we get Paul and Silas in prison. There's always a lot of pastors like to have a good laugh at this story when they do a sermon on this one, because the story is kind of silly in some of its what's happening in the story. So Paul and Silas, they get put in prison, and what's funny is you think after as mad as Paul and Silas are at the end of the story, in the moment they don't act that way. And this is where once again people ask the question of why didn't Paul and Silas bring up that they were Roman citizens earlier? Well, here when they enter the prison, they kind of just decide no one's gonna listen to us anyway. Might as well have a laugh about it. No point staying mad. The mistreatment has already happened, so I guess we'll have a laugh about it. Because the rational thing that you would think would happen is that Paul and Silas would be super enraged, as they should be. But they're not. Instead, they decide to have a laugh about it. And of course, after the laughing, they kind of, sing praises to God, saying that, God is good, even though everything else is so miserable. And that's the other thing, too. I remember there was a comedian, a Christian comedian named John Chris, and he made a pretty hilarious joke about this. He said, why is it that it's only when bad things happen that we tend to use the phrase, God has a plan? So the joke goes okay, so it's hey, I just got promoted my job. Awesome. Hey, I just got fired. Hey, God has a plan. Yo, I got married last weekend. Awesome, dude. Congrats. I just went through a divorce, man. Hey, God has a plan. So it's kind of one of those it's really, and I mean, It's one of those things that like why people dislike some Christians sometimes, and understandably so. You shouldn't be saying, "Hey, God has a plan," when stuff goes wrong in people's life. Okay, like that is the last thing people want to hear. But like, it's one of those funny things in this prison story where like, yeah, you think Paul and Silas would be super mad after the mistreatment of, you know, from the mob, but instead they're just like, hey, like let's just sing praises to God and be joyful about what God is doing. Now, the obvious text would lead me to believe that maybe what they were singing praises about was that, hey, even though things went, even though the consequences of what we did, led us to some pain and mistreatment, hey, we saved a girl from, first of all, an evil spirit. So that's enough reason to sing praises. Hey, we also kind of saved a girl from, some dangerous pimps. So, glory to God. We did the Lord's work today. And so, maybe that's what they were singing praises about. And that makes logical sense that like, you know, if I was thrown in prison for saving a girl from a bunch of pimps, I would be happy about that. Okay? Like I'd be like, yeah, like I did the Lord's work today, so I should still be happy even when all these other like unfortunate things happen. So that is probably the safe assumption within the text of why they were singing worship in prison, is because they were glad that they were doing the Lord's work and that they had liberated a girl from an evil spirit as well as her human handlers who were probably pretty bad guys. So they were probably celebrating that they were doing the Lord's work, and that would be enough reason to be happy. And when I read this story, and you read those other like a lot of stories of how Christians in other parts of the world they got it rough, and a lot of Christians in other parts of the world can go to prison for being Christian, and a lot of these guys they know how to still be joyful in prison because they know that they're doing the Lord's work. Reading the story always makes me think of them, and always my prayers are always to them. And it's one of those things of like I think people forget how good they have it in like America and in Canada, that like, oh, I won't be sent to prison just because I'm Christian, but in other places of the world there are people executed. And I remember telling that one story. I'll tell it again. I told this story in the Stephen reading week, and of course the point when I told it in the Stephen story was kind of how Christians can laugh in the face of death. But basically how the story goes down is that there was this one church in China, in communist China years ago, and unfortunately they all died. All the Christians died, but these guys were so confident in the resurrection, and they were so proud that they were doing the Lord's work that they didn't care that the communists threatened them with death. It's like they were like, no, we're gonna do the Lord's work, and we'll believe in Jesus no matter what. And then of course the funny part of the story is when the communists were like, we're gonna kill you, and then the church members were fighting who was gonna die first. And then so the first guy goes like, well, I'm the oldest person in this church, so I should die first, first in, first out kind of thing. And then the second guy goes, no, 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 I'm the pastor, so you should kill me first. And then the third guy goes, no, 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 I'm the longest running elder, so you should kill me first. And so they were kind of having like a joke. They were kind of having a laugh, as they were going to be facing death, because I mean, sometimes you just gotta laugh in the face of death. They were volunteering. They were basic. Well, when I told the Stephen account story, the idea was that they knew they were dead, so they might as well have a laugh with it. Like they knew their fates were sealed. Just like when Stephen entered the Sanhedrin, when he was accused of blasphemy, like Stephen knew he was dead. That was the point I was making with that story. But in the same way, you think of these Christians in other parts of the world that get thrown in prison because of their faith, and a lot of these guys, they can still be positive. You hear some of the, you hear stories of guys who actually like they make it out of the prison. Some of them are released, some of them escape, and they tell about like how it wasn't the worst thing that happened to them. And they talk about how, like, you know, it was because I was doing something right that, you know, I was thrown in prison. And so I can't be bitter about it. All I can do is celebrate that I am doing what is right. And it's stories like that like, yeah, like you shouldn't be too worried about when people try to do evil to you because you do what's right. You should be joyful that you're doing what's right. And I mean, you can even tone this down from like a religious stand. Like, you don't have to take this from a religious standpoint. You know, you can think of people who they want to help people, and other people may scrutinize them for it. You know, people who take a stand against like child grooming, for instance, and then people just backlash at them and call them transphobes or whatever. But those people are like happy to be called transphobes because they're like, no, I'm doing what's right. I'm protecting kids from dangerous people. I'm doing the Lord's work, right? Stuff like that, you know. And people are happy that they get canceled on the internet because of stuff like that. They're like, no, I'm doing what's right, you know, and I'm proud that I'm doing what's right. And that's something that, like, once again, you know, you read this moment where Paul and Silas are praising God in prison. I think that's something that I'm always reminded of stories like that. And once again, I am reading a little bit into the text at this point. But at the same time, I think it's a healthy attitude that we should have as we read this story. Is that, like, yeah, you know, like, we will be mistreated. There will be injustices. There will be evil that comes against us when you do what's right. When you're doing, you know, the Lord's work. When you're spreading the gospel or whatever, you will face those things. But you should always be. You should have an upbeat attitude, and, you know, always remember that God is good, even when you're facing like terrible things like that. I think that's something that the story is a good reminder of as well. You just see that Paul and Silas are like, they're praising God in prison. You know, the dank ass, dark, smelly prison cell, and they're chained up with stocks on them and stuff like that. And they're like, oh, well, I guess we got nothing better to do. Let's sing some worship songs. The last thing you would expect to happen in a prison. But I think the story is a great reminder that we should always find the joy even when the world is trying to give us misery. And I mean, that's all the more reason, I guess you could say, is that all the more reason to have your joy secure in the Lord, I guess is how the typical Christian says it. That's how we say in Christianese, you know, to have the joy of the Lord in the face of adversity. And, you know, the way of thinking of that is, you know, to always maintain that, you know, upbeat attitude even when everything's going downhill. Because, you know, at the end of the day, and even with all the scary things going on in the world, we know that, like, well, Jesus is the life, and we have life with him forever. And so there is no reason to cower in despair, I guess. Like, in true despair and the hopelessness that so many have because they don't have the resurrection life. Right? But I think that's one of the things I get from this prison story, first and foremost, is just always maintain that upbeat attitude. Continuing on, so basically, while they're singing and worshiping, Paul and Silas, there's an earthquake because I guess they get a miracle this time. Doesn't happen all the time, but they get it this time. So an earthquake happens, and then the funny thing is that, like, so the Bible tells us that everybody, like, all the prison doors open and all the stocks break, or all the chains break, or whatever. And so it's funny because what could have happened was chaos. And I think there's an interesting contrast here between the prison scene and the exorcism scene just earlier in chapter 16. So in chapter 16, it starts with restoration, or not the start of chapter 16, but the start of the story, I should say. It starts with a restoration, and then there's chaos. So the girl is healed, and then there's chaos, which is like, what? But then in the prison scene, it starts with chaos, an earthquake, and then there's order. Or let me put it this way. Sorry, it starts with destruction, not chaos. It starts with destruction, the breaking of the prison doors, and the earthquake. But then there's order, in the fact that all the prisoners are still there. They're not just like prison break, but rather all the prisons stay, which is really interesting because, of course, that was essential for this warden to not kill himself. Now you're probably thinking, well, why would he feel the need to kill himself when he thought the prisoners escaped? Well, I guess if you're asking that question, you're only looking at it from a 21st century perspective. Because back then, and not just the Romans, but many ancient civilizations treated like work this way. You can think of like, I guess a more easily relatable example is like how samurai are. If the samurai fails to perform the duty to the shogun, they can be executed. You can be executed for failing the shogun. And it could be in something pretty trivial too, because I guess shoguns were just, that self-absorbed, viewing themselves as gods, right? That they can just play with people's lives like that. But that's besides the point. The idea was that if a samurai failed their duty to their masters, then they could be executed. In the same way, like, the Roman warden here in Acts 16, if he just messed up his job, he might just get fired. It doesn't work like that. It's not like in the world today, we are more humane. Firing is if firing is the worst thing that can happen to you for doing a bad job at your job, that's like the most humane thing that could happen. Because in the ancient world, people were not like that. It's not, you just get fired and then you go look for another job. It doesn't work like that. In the ancient world, you fail your job like that, especially a big job like being a warden of a prison. No, that calls for your head. And so the warden trying to kill himself in the story actually makes it's one of the things that, like, once again, to a modern reader it might seem foreign, but if you understand like ancient civilizations, it's not at all a weird notion that he would do this. Because the world back then was very harsh today compared to today. I mean, people talk about like, today, things so bad today. It's like, no. Things are great today, okay? I don't know what people are telling you, but if you think the world today is bad, like, you imagine these guys that lived in the ancient world. Like, you didn't get fired from your job. You had one job and you stuck with it your entire life because it was either that or you died. And so, with the warden here feeling that he failed his job, and all the prisoners escaped, he was like, "Well, I'm gonna get beheaded anyway, so I might as well just save the trouble and just kill myself here," which sounds really messed up when you say it out loud like that, but that was how it was back then, and it was not pretty. Yeah, ancient civilizations were brutal like that. But Paul, saves the guy. He says, "Hey, we're all here," and it's ironic, as I mentioned earlier. There's the destruction that leads to order. And so Paul's like, hey, we're all here. What do you mean you're all here? Like, it's funny, we're like, the rest of the prisoners might actually be bad guys. Unlike Paul and Silas, they're just kind of thrown in prison because they essentially destroyed someone's like business, using a young girl for fortune telling. Not a great business. It's really exploitative if you think about it. But anyway, that's besides the point. So, like Paul and Silas, okay, yeah, they may not be great guys because they ruined some people's business. But, the rest of these prisoners in this prison, they may be way worse guys. And so a lot of these guys might be thinking like, sweet, we're getting out of here, prison break time. But the funny part of the story is that doesn't happen. In a weird twist of fate, there's order in the prison after destruction, which is a huge contrast to the mob that had disorder and chaos after healing, which is very, very interesting. And I always make this funny joke too. This is the cynical Christian in me coming out. But I sometimes when people talk about like, oh, miracles and stuff like that today, yeah, and I know I already got into this conversation quite a bit, but some people would say like, oh, like God should do a healing miracle today more often. I'm like, dude, no, man. I'd rather have like God do earthquakes and stuff, because then order will come out of it. If God just healed everybody all the time, dude, you have no idea the amount of chaos that would come out of it. And I mean, this Bible story is a case in point. The healing miracle is what led to chaos, but it's a destruction miracle that leads to order. I'll take the destruction any day, because order over chaos any day. So, you know, I'll take my wins where I can get them. And it's one of those things too that once again it's like, and this is me speaking as an older man, I guess you could say. So now we had the cynical Christian earlier. Now we have the old man speaking now. And the old man in me thinks that like, you should it's always better to look at things for more long-term gain. You should just look at life that way. When you're younger, you don't think that way, and understandably so. When you're young, you feel you can do whatever you want all the time, so you don't worry about the long term. When you're old like me, it's like, no, you gotta think on like the long term a lot more. And so if I think about like stuff like healing miracles and chaos, and then like destruction, and then destruction miracles, and then order, if I'm thinking long term game, I'm gonna take the destruction so I can have that order later. Because I remember that old meme someone put with like Lord of the Rings, and it was like, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an elf, with the awesome weapon skills and kicking ass. But as I got older, I realized I want to be a hobbit with the quiet Shire life. And I'm like, you know what? That's so true. That's so true. And so, I will take my destruction miracle for order any day. And so, here we go, cynical Christian coming back out. Yeah, healing miracles, a little overrated if it's going to lead to like mad mobs and stuff like that. Which, that does happen. You hear stories about like people who get like the blessings in life, and then like after that, they get so much antagonism, spiritual attacks from the enemy and whatever, and then of course attacks from people, right? Like, dude, man, like, nah, I'm too old for that now. I'll take I'll take the route that has more order at the end, which I think is also like, and if you look at it from a large narrative perspective, that's basically the Book of Revelation, isn't it? The Book of Revelation is like, Jesus does the whole like final destructive miracle, if you will, in like the sickest bloodbath in the history of sick bloodbaths. And then after that, Jesus does the whole New Jerusalem thing. So like I want that, right? So I'll take the destruction for order at the end. I think that's the better way of going about things. Maybe this is, I know it's like super dark and cynical, and the dark cynical side of me is coming out, which is a good sign that the stream should end soon before we get too crazy. But in all seriousness, like, I don't know, that's kind of how I see things. And I think the story kind of plays at that pretty well. What the hell was that? That was the weirdest notification noise I have ever heard on my phone. Anyway, I mean, I think, and I'm now and I know I'm grasping a little bit of straws here at this point, but I think there's that parallel with, I'm making that parallel with Revelation. I should say I'm making that parallel, because I don't think the Bible explicitly does this. So I'm going to say I'm grabbing at straws. If you want to agree with me on this, you can, but I'm letting you know now, this is me grabbing at straws a little bit. But I think there is that little like tie-in with Revelation with this story, I think, where once again is that like God does something destructive but then brings order. And so in Paul's very small case, it's the order of the prisoners all staying, and then that leads to the warden being baptized and the warden becoming a believer. And so yeah, I mean it's kind of a weird like sequence of actions where like big ass earthquake and then goes down to a crowd of people acting orderly for a change. Instead of prisoners being chaotic like prisoners normally would be. And then it leads to one guy and his family being saved. It's very interesting that like it kind of narrows down like that. And Revelation kind of has that, right? I think that's one of the things that like, if I were to do a study on the book of Revelation, God willing in 2023, maybe we'll do that. But if I do a book, if I were to do a study on Revelation, I think one of the major pitfalls that I have a frustration with that people make in regards to the book of Revelation is that people always focus on the big part, the earthquake part of it, if you will. And they look at all the bad things happening, the horsemen, just death, destruction everywhere, meteors and aliens and crap like that, all the weird stuff that Revelation has. But then they don't narrow it down to like, hey man, there's the resurrection, or sorry, not the resurrection, before the resurrection. There's the new heaven and new Jerusalem, the order in this story. Paralleling with Paul here. So there's the destruction, earthquake in Book of Acts, all the crazy stuff in Revelation, and then we have the order of the otherwise wild prisoners in the Book of Acts. God taking down the old earth and old heaven for new earth and new heaven and new Jerusalem. And then you get to the fine point. One man and his family is saved, and is given eternal life through that. Book of Revelation. Jesus establishes the new kingdom, and now he lives with his people. He truly lives with them in the new kingdom. And so it starts from the big crazy, and it narrows down to the moment of real peace. And I think that's something that, I don't know, I know I'm grabbing a little bit of straws here, but I think there is that little Revelation parallel, just because I was thinking about it a little bit. And you are dealing with that, the cynical Parson at this point. But I think there is that parallel there that can be made. Once again, I am grabbing at straws, so, don't try and grip too many straws with me, because then we'll both fall. But I think that parallel can be made, because I think once again, I think what the Bible's getting at is that it is, despite the crazy, despite the big things that are happening, the big earth shakers, if you will, and I think the earthquake metaphor works pretty well, the big earth shaking things going on, focus on your perfect peace, the person of Jesus Christ, that, in Acts 16, this warden finds that. And in Revelation, we all have that connection with Jesus Christ. And then that's kind of something that we need to be reminded of often. And, as I mentioned already, that's one of my big frustration with people's pitfalls of the book of Revelation, is that it's like you guys focus too much on the earthquake thing. Which, yes, obviously is important because it leads to everything else. But God will bring order. That's the new earth, new heaven, new earth thing. Right? God will bring order. I thought this is once again where Christians, in Christianese, they always talk about like, well, God is sovereign. That's actually what they're talking about, but I know a lot of Christians don't say it that way. Like, they talk about, how in Revelation, God will bring order to all things in a new heaven and new Jerusalem, a new heaven, new earth kind of thing. That's what Christians actually mean when they talk about like God being sovereign. But many Christians don't explain that very well. So then a Christian will say that, in Christianese, and then like the average person would be like, "What are you talking like?" Right? But anyway, and then of course, there's the most important thing is that we have our sights focused on the person of Jesus, just like the warden does, and is saved in chapter 16. Anyway, I think I'm gonna stop there because that was a lot for chapter 16. And then we got chapter 17 and 18. Those are gonna be like, I should be able to do 17 and 18 in 1 week, because even though there's a lot of content in them, and to be fair, today I kind of extended it by some like ramblings, just to make the stream longer. Because I could have done chapter 16 in 1 hour. Honestly, I could have. I just didn't. But that's besides the point. We're gonna start with chapter 16. I know we're gonna fall. That means we're falling a little bit behind now, but just gotta deal with it. With that said, we just do some basic housekeeping. So, because as I mentioned in the description, I kind of implied it. I said at the beginning of the stream, and I'll say it again now. We will be changing our Bible reading streams to Wednesdays at 3 o'clock. And the main reason for this is because my work schedule has changed, and I work on Fridays now. And I work Friday morning to like 4 o'clock. So it wouldn't work to do the Friday streams now. Because I don't want to stream on Friday night. That would, well, for reasons. I don't need to go too deep into it. You just gotta accept what I say here. But for reasons, I don't want to do streams on Friday nights. And, you know, to change days of like streams, how it's going to look for the next little while. So with that said, I'm going to try and get the Book of Acts done before August. That's going to be the aim. Probably not going to happen. If it doesn't happen, we'll just have to figure out how to stream the last few readings of the Book of Acts. Because we're actually like kind of far in the Book of Acts. I think there's like, what, 8 more chapters? Something like that. And so that would be like, if we manage to get 2 in each week, that should only take us like 4 to 5 weeks. And we'll stream all those. We'll stream for all through July on Wednesdays, because of course Fridays now I'm working. So with that said, that does bring questions about what will go after the Book of Acts, because I have said multiple times we'll probably do the Book of Romans, but we'll have to figure out how we're going to do that. I'll have more information on that down the road. As far as streams are concerned, though, that means we are limiting quite a bit. So especially, and the other thing too is that like, because July is going to be super busy for reasons. July is going to be super busy, so we'll have to cut down the stream. So basically, just be like Wednesdays mostly. We'll have some Monday game streams. I'll play around a little bit. We'll find stuff to play. And I will try to be more like intentional doing Monday streams, because we'll only stream twice a week for the next little while. I'll have to start some scheduling stuff. In July, we'll be pretty busy. So that's kind of how it's looking right now. So that means, for the time being, there will not be Friday streams, because I'm working, and so we'll move the reading streams to Wednesday. I'll try and be more intentional about doing Monday game streams for the next next week, because we're almost at the end of June. So we have 1 more week in June next week, and then after that we have 4 weeks in July. So the next 5 weeks, basically, that's how it's gonna be. We're gonna play a game, some kind of whatever game on Mondays, and then probably not super long though, so I'll probably still start like 3 o'clock, but hit the subscribe so that and the notification so that you know when I actually am on air, because it may move around for the game streams a bit. And then for Wednesdays, for the next while, we'll do our reading streams at 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Well, it's 5:30 to the best of my abilities, to 3 to 5:30 for reading streams on Wednesdays. So that's kind of how it's going to look for the next little while. And then August, we have a big project going on. I might as well tell you what it is now. I mean, you should be able to guess it at this point, because I've like hinted at it so many times. But a game I am very looking forward to is coming out at the end of July. That's Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and yes, we are streaming it on the channel with my buddy Shining Light. He's going to be hanging out with us as I play through Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and those will be Monday, Wednesday. And I know I'm going to need every Monday, Wednesday 2 to 6 on all those streams. Because I mean, Xenoblade Chronicles, dude. Like the game takes like that's like a 100-hour game. So like at least, and that's assuming I don't get a bunch of game overs because I suck at video games or something like that, right? So I mean, TLDR, we're gonna be heavy focused on Xenoblade Chronicles 3 come August. So that's the big announcement of what we're. That's how the channel's gonna be for next while. So basically for the month of July, well next week as well, but next week in the month of July, we're gonna try and finish the Book of Acts on Wednesday streams. Monday we'll kind of just play whatever, and then August we'll focus on Xenoblade Chronicles. I'll try and figure out how to get readings in there at some point. So I'll have more information on that as we move closer to August. And of course, as we finish through the Book of Acts first, like one book at a time here, So as we finish through the Book of Acts, I'll have a lot more information of how we're gonna take on Bible reading streams in the future. So with that said, that's kind of how streams are looking for the next little while. If you guys enjoyed today's reading, leave a like, subscribe. I'll be back on Monday for something. I don't know yet. We'll play something on Monday. And then we'll continue the Book of Acts with chapter 17 next Wednesday at 3 o'clock Pacific time. With that said, hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I'll see you guys next week. God bless you. And take care of yourselves.